would like to thank you all for taking the time to visit the channel and watch the videos. And a special shout out to those of you who have generously sent a super thanks or become a channel member. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can see the names of all our amazing members on the screen right now. And if you would like to become a member of Briefcase, there is a link in the description with all of the details. Today we will look at 4 officially unsolved cases from the 19th and early 20th centuries. Although these mysteries remain unsolved, you may find yourself drawing conclusions about the possible perpetrators. In case number 1, we go to England in the year 1914. January of 1914 was a particularly cold month in England. On the 28th of December, heavy snow had fallen over much of the country, and this had caused damage to roads and property. Although the snow only lasted for about a week, the new year had started with temperatures only slightly above freezing. Thursday, the 8th of January, was a particularly cold day, and the passengers on the 4:14 p.m. North London Railway train from Chalk Farm Station to Broad Street were all dressed in their winter coats. Most also wore hats and scarves. At 4:29, the train pulled into Maiden Lane Station, where a young man who worked as a messenger, named Robert Stilwell, got on to the third-class carriage. The train called at the stations at Caledonian Road, Highbury and Canonbury, and although it was very cold, it seemed like any other January day. However, the young man's journey took a terrifying turn. As the train pulled out of Midway Park Station, he suddenly noticed a small hand protruding from under the seat in front of him. Frightened and unable to get the attention of the porter, the boy waited anxiously until the train reached Shoreditch. With his heart pounding, he hurriedly ran to the station master's office to report the chilling sight he had witnessed. The station master promptly stopped the train and informed the authorities. The police soon arrived, and to their horror, beneath the seats in the compartment where Robert Stilwell had sat, they found the lifeless body of a 5 or 6-year-old boy who had quite long golden curly hair. The child's face was bruised, there was blood on his lips and marks on his neck, which indicated the use of a cord. The train had been doing the same journey, backwards and forwards all day, so the police wondered how long the body may have been there. A cleaner told detectives that he had cleaned the carriage at 3:36 p.m. and he had not seen a child's body. A post-mortem later revealed that the young boy had been dead for no more than 2 hours, and the cause of death was strangulation. Police wondered who may have committed such a terrible crime. Was the perpetrator someone known to the child, or a complete stranger? They also needed to ascertain at which railway station did the murderer get on board. Initially, they believed that the murder was committed before the perpetrator got onto the train, and that the railway journey was taken for the sole purpose of hiding the dead child. But who was this poor young boy, found under the seat of a third-class train carriage? The body was taken to the Old Street police station, where later that evening, Mrs. Agnes Starchfield identified the child to be her son, 5-year-old William Starchfield. Mrs. Starchfield was no stranger to tragedy and grief. Her 2 other children had passed away due to natural causes. She told officers that this had put much strain on her marriage and that she was now living apart from her husband. She added that she had resided with William at Hampstead Road, and although she struggled financially, she was a devoted mother. When asked where her husband now lived, Mrs. Starchfield replied that he lived in a boarding house at Hanover Court. In the early hours of Friday the 9th of January, Police Inspector Goff paid a visit to the boarding house. He was directed to the room of Mr. Starchfield, where he told the gentleman that he must accompany him to Bow Street Police Station. Mr. Starchfield agreed, although he did not know why the police may want to speak with him. Officers then asked him to give an account of his whereabouts the previous afternoon. Mr. Starchfield did as requested. He said that he was asleep at the boarding house until about 3 p.m, and when he got up, he made his way to his pitch at the Tottenham Court Road station, where he worked as a newspaper seller. He said that on his way, he stopped at a coffee shop. He added that other newspaper sellers would be able to confirm this. When asked when he had last seen his son, he replied about 3 weeks ago. The officers thanked him for his statement and then told Mr. John Starchfield the terrible news that his son had been murdered. It was now 12:45 p.m. and the distraught gentleman left the police station. Although Mr. Starchfield's estranged wife had spoken to the police the previous evening, investigators accompanied her to the police station so she too could make a formal statement. She told officers that the landlady at the house where she lived with her son at 191 Hampstead Road had sent young William to the bakers. She said that William completed this errand, and when he returned, the landlady sent him to the stationer's at 147 Hampstead Road, as she wanted him to obtain a card advertising rooms to let. However, the shop owner was not quite sure if the lady wanted a card for a furnished or an unfurnished room, so sent 2 cards back with the boy. The landlady, named Mrs. Longstaff, then sent William back to the shop with the instruction that it was for an unfurnished room. However, the child did not come back. About an hour later, Mrs. Longstaff put on her coat and went to look for William. First, she went to the stationer's at 147 Hampstead Road. She spoke to the owner, a gentleman named Mr. Chapman, who informed her that the boy had not returned to the shop. Mrs. Starchfield said that during this time she had been out trying to secure employment and came back at about 3 p.m. It was then that Mrs. Longstaff informed her that William was not yet home. The 2 ladies then went into the streets in a frantic search to try and find the missing child. At that time of day, Hampstead Road was a very busy thoroughfare, always full of workers and school children. Police did not believe that if anyone had abducted the child, that it would have gone unnoticed. They theorised that the boy was killed before he was placed on the train. Regent's Park was only 10 minutes away by foot. It was an area that in the winter was largely deserted. They wondered if the boy had met his end in some remote corner of the park. It was also only a short walk from the park to Chalk Farm Station, so if the assailant had placed William in a sack, he would not have looked out of place. It was not uncommon to see manual workers going about their business carrying sacks. The line at Chalk Farm Station was a single one, so passengers leave the train on one side and board the train from the other. The train pulls up, so the third-class carriage always stops in front of the waiting room. A man could easily have slipped out of the waiting room and onto the train unnoticed. It was also noted that the train gets busier the nearer it gets to the centre of the city. So at Chalk Farm, the train often only has a few passengers travelling on it. The murder of little William Starchfield was reported in the newspapers all across the country. There were headlines such as "A lunatic crime" and "Tragedy of young Willie." These made sure that the story caught the nation's attention. It was revealed that the murdered child's father, Mr. John Starchfield, had made national newspaper headlines in September 1912 when he bravely attempted to disarm an Armenian criminal named Stephen Titus during a gun rampage at London's Horseshoe Hotel. During this attack, Titus shot dead the manageress named Miss Tower and wounded the barmaid named Miss Grace Ray before running into the streets and wildly firing his gun. Mr. Starchfield, who had served in the army and at the time was selling newspapers opposite the hotel, tried valiantly to apprehend him. During the struggle, he was seriously wounded after being shot in the chest, but he managed to hold the man down for long enough until help arrived. Following this, Mr. Starchfield spent many weeks in hospital. At the trial of Mr. Titus, Mr. Starchfield was hailed a hero and was awarded a payment of £50. However, he had received great support from the newspapers and the public and was also granted £1 a week from the Carnegie Hero Fund. Stephen Titus was found to be insane. The police distributed a photo of young William Starchfield to the press in the hope that someone may remember seeing him on that fatal day. The police also made house-to-house and shop-to-shop inquiries. A piece of string with a loop and a hair attached was discovered at the Tufnell Park tube station, and an omnibus conductor told detectives that shortly before 3 p.m. on Thursday the 8th of January, a boy fitting the description of the deceased child got onto the bus with a foreign-looking man. However, the conductor said that the child seemed reluctant to do so. He added that the pair got off at Tufnell Park tube station. This was interesting for the police, as the staircase at the station was a little used in the afternoons and would have given a man enough time to strangle a child and place the body in a bag. On the 13th of January, an inquest was opened, and it was announced that the eminent pathologist, Dr. Spilsbury, had conducted a second autopsy on the deceased boy. Detectives now believed that young William Starchfield was alive when he got on the train with the assailants and was murdered sometime between the train leaving Chalk Farm and arriving at Maiden Lane, a period of less than 15 minutes. As investigators pieced together the events leading to the tragedy, some witnesses came forward to tell of their encounters with the child and a mysterious man on that fatal day. The whereabouts of William's father, Mr. John Starchfield, was of great interest to the police. A fellow lodger named Mr. William Tilley told the inquest that on the day of the murder, he got up at 2:30 p.m. in the afternoon and Mr. Starchfield was still asleep. One key witness was a lady named Miss Clara Woods, who told of how she noticed a child eating a cake with a man with a moustache wearing a dark coat. She said that they were walking hand in hand towards Camden Town Station. She added that when she passed them in the street, she said, "Oh, bless it." When asked if she recognised the man, she pointed to Mr. John Starchfield. This observation was crucial, as a post-mortem had revealed the presence of partially digested food in William's stomach that contained currants. A man named John White also identified Mr. Starchfield as the man he had seen at Camden Town Station with a young boy who he believed was William. Other witnesses included a boy named Angelo Portinari, who told of how he often played with William, and at 1 p.m. on the 8th of January, he saw him with a slightly older boy. He said that William was carrying firewood. A signalman named George Jackson informed the inquest that he was on duty at the St Pancras box when he saw the train from Chalk Farm pass. It was 2:18 p.m. and there was a man with a dark coat and a moustache leaning over someone. Another man, named William Mercer, an engine driver, told how he saw a powerfully built man in a third-class carriage, leaning over as if he was tying a parcel. A man named Mr. Moore, who was a timber merchant, told the court that he had not seen Mr. Starchfield for 2 years, but on the 8th of January had seen him holding a little boy's hand. He said the boy was tidily dressed. Following the inquest, the jury returned a verdict of wilful murder, and Mr. John Starchfield was charged with this most horrible crime. The funeral of young William took place on Saturday the 17th of January. Over 3,000 mourners lined the streets, their heads bowed, as a procession made its way to Kensal Street Cemetery. 30 police officers, along with 4 on horseback, managed the crowds. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, Mrs. Starchfield broke down with grief. This was the 3rd child that she had buried. The trial of Mr. John Starchfield began on Tuesday the 31st of March 1914, and he pleaded not guilty. The same witnesses were presented who had given evidence at the inquest. His defence team thoroughly cross-examined every prosecution witness, and the credibility of Mr. Moore and Mrs. Wood was called into question when it was revealed that both had seen a photograph of the defendant in a newspaper before they identified him. Mrs. Wood was also familiar with the cake shop in Hampstead Road, and Mr. Moore had asked if he may get a reward for information that leads to a conviction. The defence claimed that this raised serious doubts about their testimony. It was also pointed out that since giving his evidence at the inquest, Mr. Moore had been found in a very bad way after attempting to take his own life. And of course, there were also witnesses who placed the defendant in his lodging house at the time the child was murdered. As a result, the prosecution witnesses who had identified the defendant as a man they had seen with the deceased child could not be relied upon, and the trial collapsed. The judge instructed the jury to return a formal verdict of not guilty. The inquest and subsequent trial had held a potential for justice, but the not guilty verdict also shed light on the social circumstances surrounding the tragedy. William had faced hardships with the loss of 2 siblings and the separation of his parents. Agnes Starchfield's effort to find work while raising her beloved boy exemplified the struggles of working-class families during that era. The community's response to the death of young William and the subsequent inquest and trial was immense. British newspapers reported the case up and down the country, with people expressing shock and sympathy for the bereaved family. Agnes Starchfield's anguish continued to haunt her, leading her to a desperate and emotional breakdown. In June of 1914, she was arrested after expressing a desire to end her life, burdened by the grief of losing her precious son. 6 weeks later, on the 28th of July, she appeared in court, accused of striking a married lady named Lucy Delgado. It was said that she had been on good terms with the lady, but on the 8th of July had insulted her and struck her twice in the face. Mrs. Starchfield said that she did this in self-defence. However, she was found to be guilty. The judge said that she appeared to be a neurotic and excitable woman. He then ordered her to pay the sum of £5 and bound her over to keep the peace for the next 12 months. In 1916, John Starchfield passed away due to the consequences of his gunshot wound. He always maintained that he was innocent of his son's murder. He believed that the murder was an act of revenge, orchestrated by a friend of Stephen Titus. 2 years later, a man named John Fitzpatrick, hailing from Liverpool, confessed to the murder of William. The 40-year-old individual, who was described as a drifter, provided a story that did not align with the known facts of the case. He was examined by a doctor who concluded that he was suffering from insanity. Consequently, it was concluded that he could not have committed the crime. Over the years, the memory of William Starchfield's murder faded from public consciousness. As time passed, the unsolved case became one of many forgotten tragedies of history, leaving behind only fragments of newspaper articles and archive records as a testament to the boy's short life and ultimately his death. Today, William Starchfield's grave lies quietly in a corner of the cemetery, surrounded by the memories of those who once mourned his loss. The tragic tale of this young boy, forever etched in the annals of history, serves as a poignant reminder of the fragility of life and the far-reaching impact of unresolved crimes on the life of those left behind. Case 2, we go to the USA in the late 19th century. At the end of the 19th century, industry was rapidly expanding throughout the United States of America. Some states, however, such as Indiana, still had a very large farming community. In the 1890s, Indiana had 22 million acres of farmland, growing many different crops, including corn, wheat, oats, barley, rye, sweet potatoes and tobacco. Like much of the American Midwest, Indiana's exports remained largely linked to agriculture until the 1920s. Frederick Shanks had a farm on the very edge of Fountain County in Indiana. He lived there with his wife and 6 children and was considered to be a hard-working man. Opposite lived Mr. Dan Keller and his wife named Nanny. Mr. Keller was 28 years old and also had a farm, but his was just across the county line in Park County, Indiana. The two families had always got on as neighbours and had never had any reason to quarrel. Since 1890, the American Midwest had suffered from a lack of rainfall. This was compounded by the fact that since the introduction of the railroads, many people had settled in states such as Indiana, Iowa, Kansas and Minnesota. Many had done so with unrealistic expectations of the productivity of the land. The amount of land required to support a family in the more arid regions was already larger than the amount that could realistically be irrigated by a family. But this fact was made more obvious during the dry periods, and in the summer of 1895, Indiana was suffering another drought. This meant that Mr. Shanks had to get water from Mr. Keller's property. This was not an issue, The farmers would always help each other, and Mr. and Mrs. Keller did not object to Mr. Shanks walking through their yards in order to fetch water. Mr. Shanks, however, did not do this himself, and instead gave the task to his 18-year-old daughter, Clara. She was known in the neighbourhoods to be a particularly beautiful young lady, and young men would notice her wherever she went. As Clara continued to fetch the water, Mrs. Keller started to get quite concerned. She did not really want such an attractive young lady continuously walking across her yard. She noticed that her husband, Mr. Dan Keller, would often stop and talk to young Clara. Of course, Clara would reply. After all, she was a polite girl, and she knew that the Kellers did not have to let them cross their property in order to get water. Mrs. Nanny Keller, however, did not see it that way. Instead, she believed that Clara was deliberately flirting with her husband and was intent in trying to seduce him. Clara's two younger brothers would often see Mr. Keller working in his yard, and whenever they did, they would shout to Clara, "Hey sis, there goes your fella." This only added to Mrs. Keller's suspicion that something was going on between her husband and Clara. By now, quite jealous of the attention that her husband seemed to give the beautiful young 18-year-old, Mrs. Keller started to tell neighbours of her concern and of the inappropriate behaviour of Miss Clara Shanks. Eventually, Clara's elder brother Daniel heard of the allegations. He was surprised, as he had always thought his sister to be a polite and well-behaved young lady. He decided to speak to Mrs. Keller, so on the 5th of July, he went to the Kellers' house to ask why Mrs. Keller was saying these things about his sister. Mrs. Keller told him that she believed there was something improper going on between Clara and her husband, and that Clara would no longer be permitted to cross their yard to get water. Instead, Daniel Shanks must tell his father to send another family member to fetch it. There was now tension between the two families, so the following morning, Nanny Keller, her husband Dan, and Dan's sister, Miss Margaret Keller, decided that they should go and see Mr. and Mrs. Shanks and try to sort out their differences. After all, they were neighbours. The US economy had been going through a period of recession, and things had been made even more difficult due to the droughts. They did not want to make an enemy of Mr. and Mrs. Shanks. The Kellers stood by the rail fence that separated the two properties and called for Clara. However, her brother would not let her come to the door. Eventually, Clara's mother responded, and Mrs. Keller told her that she believed that her daughter Clara had been conducting an improper relationship with her husband. Mrs. Shanks replied that she did not think the accusation to be true, but Mrs. Keller then turned to her husband and said, "Will you let them deny what I say?" Dan Keller did not deny any relationship with Clara. Mrs. Shanks then went back inside her house and closed the door. At dinner, Clara's father, Mr. Frederick Shanks, was told for the first time of the allegation. He asked his daughter if it were true, and Clara replied that it was not. There was a strange silence, and after a few minutes, Clara got up. She left the table and then left the house. A few hours passed, and as Clara had not returned, her mother sent out her other children to look for her. As they walked past the Keller's yards, Dan Keller looked up and shouted, "If you are looking for Clara, my wife saw her going down the lane more than an hour ago." The children searched the area known as Wolf Creek and called out for Clara, but they could not find her. Everything seemed very quiet. Then suddenly one of them would call out for their sister again. As it started to get dark, they all returned home. That night, Mrs. Shanks had a very disturbing dream. She dreamt that her daughter was struggling in the pool at the foot of Wolf Creek Falls at 5 a.m. and unable to sleep very much. She got up. Her eldest son Daniel had also had a troubled night worrying about his sister. Mrs. Shanks told him about her dream. They had searched that area the previous day, but not looked by the pool, only in the thicket that surrounded it. Daniel immediately put on his boots and ran to the pool. It was not far from their house, only about half a mile. When he entered the water, he saw his sister. She was lying in about 5 feet of water. Strangely, however, Daniel made no attempt to pull the lifeless body from the pool. Instead, he went straight back to the house, retrieved his shotgun, and marched towards the Keller's property. From their front gate, he shouted, Clara is drowned in Wolf Creek Falls, and you caused it." Dan Keller, seemingly a little tired, came to the door. As he did, Daniel Shanks fired his shotgun twice. Fortunately, both times his shot hit the edge of the doorframe. Dan Keller quickly retreated inside his house. His wife then went outside to plead with Daniel Shanks to stop firing. Fortunately, a neighbour appeared named James Rice. He had heard the commotion and persuaded Daniel Shanks to go home. Soon word spread of the death of young Clara Shanks. Her body was removed from the pool at Wolf Creek and taken back to the home of her parents. Here a post-mortem was performed. Although this was hastily arranged and not conducted in any great detail, the two doctors concluded that Miss Clara Shanks had taken her own life by drowning. The next day, Dan Keller went to the town of Rockville in Park County and in front of Deputy Sheriff McCain took out a warrant against Daniel Shanks for the unprovoked attack against him and his wife. However, when the Deputy Sheriff went to the Shanks property to serve the warrants, he was met by many men who said that they were representing the citizens of Fountain County, and if the Deputy Sheriff arrested Daniel Shanks, they would hang Dan Keller. The Deputy Sheriff decided that in this instance he would return to Rockville and would not serve the warrant against Daniel Shanks. The next day, Clara was buried at the Zachmeyer Cemetery. The funeral service was attended by most of the residents who lived in Wolf Creek Valley. By now, tension was running high, and not wanting anyone to take the law into their own hands, a meeting was held at the old schoolhouse to decide what should be done. Another meeting was held the following evening. The local people believed that something untoward had happened to young Clara Shanks, so a delegation was sent to petition the authorities to conduct another autopsy. Whilst this was being considered, the police searched the thicket that surrounded Wolf Creek Falls. If Clara had been murdered, they needed to find any comprehensive proof that would support this. There were reports that evidence of a struggle had been found, including an area where a body could possibly have been dragged towards the Wolf Creek pool. This included a footprint from a man's shoe and some blood on the thicket. Witnesses had also come forward, and although no one had seen Clara in the vicinity of Wolf Creek Pool in the afternoon of Saturday the 6th of July 1895, there was a group of young men who had spent much of the day swimming and bathing by the pool. They informed the authorities that there was no body in the pool during the time that they were there, and that they had seen nothing suspicious. This led the police to conclude that Clara's body was not placed in the Wolf Creek Pool until after midnight, and was then discovered the following morning. Everyone seemed to be convinced that Dan Keller had had something to do with the death of Clara. Public sentiment had very much turned against him, so feeling somewhat uneasy, he took his family to live with his brother, Mr. George Keller, who lived about 2 miles from the home of Mr. and Mrs. Shanks. As news of Clara's tragic death spread throughout Fountain and Park counties, people started to descend on Wolf Creek Valley to see the pool where the body was discovered. They would also walk past the homes of Mr. and Mrs. Shanks and Mr. and Mrs. Keller, and as they did, they would theorise as to what exactly happened on the night of the 6th of July. The press were particularly interested in the story. Journalists from various newspapers conducted interviews with both Mr. and Mrs. Shanks and Mr. and Mrs. Keller. However, whatever they thought of each other, neither couple would actually suggest that the other was responsible for the death of Clara. 10 days passed before it was agreed that another autopsy should take place, and this would be carried out by doctors from both Park and Fountain counties. The body had already started to decompose, which made the task quite difficult. Nevertheless, after a thorough investigation, it was confirmed that Miss Clara Shanks had been murdered. Bruises were found on her head, her skull had been fractured, and her neck had been broken, and as no water was found in her larynx or her lungs, the possibility of death by drowning was ruled out. The theory that she took her own life was also dismissed, as the 6 doctors who examined her declared that on her death, Miss Clara Shanks had no cause to be ashamed, as she had never been intimate with anyone and died a respectable young lady. By the 9th of August, the authorities believed that they had enough evidence to arrest Mr. Dan Keller, his wife Mrs. Nanny Keller, and his sister Miss Margaret Keller, all of whom were taken into custody and charged with the murder of Miss Clara Shanks. The police also arrested Dan Keller's brother, and he was charged with being an accessory to murder. The killer's attorney was quick to counter the opinion that his clients had committed this terrible crime. He circulated the idea that the death of Clara had somehow been caused by her own family. He pointed out just how easily Daniel Shanks had located his sister's body in the early morning of Sunday the 7th of July, and said that the apparent dream of Mrs. Shanks was too realistic to have come from a sleeping brain. He also reminded the press that Mr. and Mrs. Keller had told the police that they had seen Daniel Shanks cross the field and walk towards Wolf Creek on 2 occasions in the afternoon on the day that Miss Clara Shanks went missing. In fact, Mrs. Nanny Keller had said that his manner was very suspicious, and this was also the opinion of Miss Margaret Keller. With their home now unattended, their farm was visited by people who wished to take souvenirs from the house where it had been reported a murder had been committed. The Kellers were kept in jail until the day of the trial. The trial began on the 27th of January 1896, and as the case had caused so much publicity in Fountain and Park counties, it took place in the city of Terre Haute in Vigo County. The Kellers were indicted on 9 separate charges in order to cover all the different means which could have been used to murder Clara. The prosecution claimed that on Saturday the 6th of July, Clara had gone to the property of Mr. and Mrs. Keller to confront Mrs. Keller and ask her to retract the accusation that she had been intimate with her husband. An altercation took place, which resulted in the death of Clara. The Kellers then hid the young girl's body in the kitchen before transporting it to Wolf Creek Falls sometime during the night. The prosecution stated that this was a distance of about half a mile, and that Mr. Dan Keller was assisted in this act by his brother, Mr. John Keller. The prosecution added that the Kellers placed the body in Wolf Creek as they wanted everyone to believe that Miss Clara Shanks had taken her own life due to the shame she had brought on herself and her family, when the reality was that she was an honest and honourable young lady who had only gone over to Mr. and Mrs. Keller's property that day in order to defend her good name and asked Mr. Keller to tell his wife the truth, which was that nothing improper had ever gone on between them. Although much of the evidence was circumstantial, the prosecution were able to show traces of blood that had been found on a pair of Dan Keller's trousers, and informed the jury that blood had also been discovered on the floor of the Keller's house, along with the remains of clothing that had been burnt in the kitchen stove. Daniel Shanks told the court that on Saturday the 6th of July, Mrs. Keller had accused his sister of conducting an intimate relationship with Mr. Keller. When Frederick Shanks questioned Clara about it, without uttering a word, she rose from the dinner table and left the house. She did not even put on her shoes, and regrettably, she never returned. He added that when he and his brothers went to look for her, they saw Mr. Keller standing in his yard. He looked over and then shouted that if they were looking for Clara, his wife had seen her going down the lane. Daniel Shanks said that they went down the lane, but they could not find Clara. He added that as they searched that afternoon, the Keller women stayed inside their house looking out of the windows, and that Dan Keller just stood in the front yard. They did not join the search. He said that he saw lamps shining in the Keller property, even after he had gone to bed. He did not sleep very much that night, as he was so worried about his sister, especially as Mrs. Keller had said that she would mash Clara's heap if she ever came onto her property again. But defence were quick to point out that on the day the body was discovered, a post-mortem was conducted by 2 physicians who found no evidence that death had been caused as a result of violence, and the following day the body was again examined by 2 different physicians whose findings were the same. In fact, it was not until 12 days had passed that the body was exhumed and another post-mortem was conducted, which concluded that the deceased had suffered from a fractured skull and a broken neck. Clara's mother, Mrs. Elizabeth Shanks, also testified. She told the court how her daughter had told her that Mrs. Keller had treated her coldly. Mrs. Shanks said that when she asked Mrs. Keller why this was, Mrs. Keller said that Clara was too friendly towards her husband. She claimed that when Mrs. Keller repeated this in front of her husband, Mr. Dan Keller did not say anything, until Mrs. Keller told him that he must confirm her accusation or make her out to be a liar. Mr. Keller then agreed with his wife. The last time Mrs. Shanks had seen her daughter alive was on the 6th of July, when she abruptly left the house during dinner, and Mrs. Shanks was of the opinion that she went to the Keller's house to demand that Mr. Dan Keller tell the truth and confirm that nothing had ever gone on between them. The trial lasted for 2 weeks, during which time the testimony of nearly 200 witnesses was heard, and every day the courtroom was packed. On Thursday the 13th of February 1896, the proceedings ended and the jury was sent out to deliberate. After 22 hours they returned to deliver their verdict. They found all the defendants not guilty. This was met with a cheer from the large crowd. The Keller family embraced and shed tears of joy. After thanking their attorneys for their efforts, they all returned home. Many people still considered that they were responsible for Clara's death, and in the years that followed, they were not treated very well by some of the local community. No one else was ever charged with the murder of beautiful Miss Clara Shanks, and the exact manner in which she met her death on the 6th of July 1895 will forever remain a mystery. In case 3, we go to 1880s England. Sarah Jane Roberts was born on the 1st of March 1862 and lived in the parish of St Michael's in the town of Pembroke in South Wales. Her father was a respectable, hard-working member of the small community, but the family did not live in very favourable circumstances. So in 1878, Sarah Jane travelled to the English city of Manchester. Her brother was already working there, and Sarah Jane found employment in domestic service. At the time, it was very common for young women to enter domestic service once they had finished school, and Sarah Jane had no problem in securing herself a position. She was very charming, with an extremely pleasant demeanour, and was described by her employers as a well-mannered, hard-working and considerate young lady. In 1879, she was offered employment in the property of Mr. Richard Greenwood and his wife Mary Ann. They were a respectable couple who lived in comfortable circumstances in the Harper Hay area of Manchester. They were both in their 70s and were anxious to employ someone to help them around the house. Mr. Greenwood was in good health, although a little deaf, but his wife found walking difficult and would spend most of the day upstairs in her bedroom. Miss Sarah Jane Roberts was happy to take up the position as housekeeper, and she proved to be a great help to both Mr. and Mrs. Greenwood. As well as being very hard-working, she was also kind-hearted and honest, and soon gained the trust of her employer. She always seemed to be happy, and Mr. and Mrs. Greenwood grew very fond of their young housekeeper. They started to treat her more like a relative than a maid. Manchester had grown significantly since the start of the Industrial Revolution, as people came to the area to work in the many factories, especially in the wool, cotton and silk industries. By 1877, horse-drawn trams had been introduced in Salford, and in 1879, the tracks were being put down in Manchester. Sarah Jane would fetch Mr. Greenwood a newspaper on most days, and she liked to learn about the changes happening in Manchester and beyond. Fortunately, Mr. Greenwood would always comment about the things that had been reported in the press, and she often heard him talking about the important events that were happening, such as in December of 1879, when the newspapers reported that a young inventor named Thomas Edison had held the first public demonstration of his incandescent light bulb in a street in Menlo Park, New Jersey. Gentlemen sometimes called at the house to ask Miss Sarah Jane if she may like to go out with them on Sundays. She occasionally obliged with their requests, and was sometimes seen walking in the park with a potential suitor. However, although she had many admirers, she did not have any one in particular, and she seemed to prefer to spend her days off in the house of Mr. and Mrs. Greenwood. On the 7th of January 1880, Mr. Greenwood's business partner, named Mr. William Cooper, called at the house. It was around midday. He knocked at the door, and Sarah Jane hurriedly made her way from the kitchen to open it. As Mr. Cooper entered the house, he noticed a letter lying on the floor. It had been hand-delivered, as it had no stamp. It must have been pushed under the door, as some had gone under the rug. He pointed it out to Sarah Jane, and asked her if it may be from an admirer. Sarah Jane picked up the letter, and saw that it was addressed to Mr. Greenwood. As she showed Mr. Cooper in,
She took the letter with her and gave it to her master. Mr. Greenwood opened it straight away, but was surprised by its contents. It read, "Mr. Greenwood, I want to take the land near the coal yard, behind the druggist shop, Queen's Road. I will pay either monthly, quarterly or yearly, and will pay in advance. I will meet you tonight, from 5 to 6 o'clock, at the 3 Tons, corner of Chernut Street, and will tell you all particulars. I don't know your address, or would have posted it. Yours, W. Wilson, Oldham Road." Mr. Greenwood found it strange that the writer claimed not to have known his address, yet came to his house to hand-deliver the letter. He did own the piece of land in question, but had no immediate plans to sell or rent it. He thought that it would be best if he just ignored the letter. His wife, however, had other ideas. She told him that he should at least meet the person who had taken the trouble to inquire about the land. After all, he may make an offer that it would be impossible to refuse. Mr. Greenwood thought about this for a while, and then told his wife that he would indeed go and meet the mysterious gentleman. The 3 Tons public house was about a mile from his residence in Westbourne Grove, in Harperhay, so in the late afternoon, Mr. Greenwood left his home and made his way to the 3 Tons. When he arrived, he asked the landlord if anyone had been looking for him. The landlord replied that there had not. Mr. Greenwood then asked if the landlord knew of a gentleman by the name of Mr. W. Wilson, but again, the landlord was unable to help. Mr. Greenwood thought it quite strange that someone would put a note through his door, inquiring about a piece of land, and requesting that he meet them later that day, only for the person not to arrive. He waited for another 15 minutes and decided to return home. Before he did, he told the landlord that if the mysterious Mr. Wilson should turn up, he should be instructed to find him at his home in Westbourne Grove. As Mr. Greenwood came towards his house, he noticed that people were standing outside. They seemed to be intrigued, as some incident had taken place. There were also 2 policemen. The day had been very strange, and Mr. Greenwood wondered what could now have happened to make his house such a place of local curiosity. He was then stopped by the police officer and told of the terrible tragedy that had occurred during his absence. After Mr. Greenwood had left his house, the milkman named Mr. James Parlington had come by to deliver the milk. He had given this to Sarah Jane, who had placed it in the cupboard in the cellar. Mr. Parlington had then continued on his rounds. A short while later, Mrs. Greenwood, who was upstairs in her bedroom, heard a knock at the front door, and then heard it close again. The door was heavy, and it always made a loud thud when it was closed. Someone must have entered the house, as Mrs. Greenwood heard footsteps. They seemed to be soft, and she thought that the visitor was probably a female. However, she did wonder if there may actually have been 2 people who had called. Mrs. Greenwood tried to walk out of her room to see who had entered the house, but as she did, she heard a loud and terrifying scream. Despite being overcome by fear, she shouted out to Sarah Jane. As she did, she heard another scream, although this time it was not as loud. Then everything went eerily quiet. By now, Mrs. Greenwood was quite afraid, but she tried to make her way downstairs, shouting out, "Murder! Murder!" as she went. Fortunately, her neighbour, a lady named Mrs. Elsa Cadman, had also heard the screams and quickly came over to the house to see what was happening. She arrived just as Mrs. Greenwood had managed to reach the front door. It was cold and dark outside, and both ladies were quite fearful that there may have been an intruder inside the house. Nevertheless, they went into the kitchen, where they saw the horrifying sights of young Miss Sarah Jane Roberts, lying motionless on the floor. Blood was coming from her head. Mrs. Greenwood called out her name, but there was no response, although she did notice that Sarah Jane murmured something. Mrs. Cadman then went outside to fetch help. Mr. Pinder, the surgeon, soon arrived. He cradled Sarah Jane's head in his arms, but she was too weak to say anything, and just a few moments later, she died. Superintendent Bent took charge of the investigation. Mr. Greenwood told him that Sarah Jane had been employed in his house for nearly a year and was a very kind-hearted person. Neither he or his wife believed that the young lady was involved with any particular suitor and could not understand why anyone would murder her. The police wondered what could have been the motive for this most brutal attack. The mysterious Mr. W. Wilson seemed to be the most likely suspect. The superintendent surmised that the letter had been delivered in order that Mr. Greenwood leave the property, meaning that Sarah Jane would be alone with Mrs. Greenwood, who was not in good health and rarely ventured downstairs. But this theory would mean that the murder had been premeditated. So why would someone go to all this trouble to murder the young housekeeper? Rumours and speculations soon spread, and different theories emerged as to who could have committed this terrible crime. A post-mortem was conducted and concluded that Sarah Jane had died from blows to the head. Her skull had been fractured in a number of places, and her hands and arms were bruised, as she had valiantly attempted to defend herself. Somewhat bizarrely, it was ordered that photographs were taken of Sarah Jane's eyes and examined under a microscope to see if there may be an impression of the murderer. Some people thought that there was a possibility that the final thing that a person saw before they died may be retained in their eye. Despite the best attempts of the coroner and the police, they were unable to make out any such image. The funeral took place on the 10th of January, and hundreds of people lined the streets as a cortege travelled towards the church. Sarah Jane's mother Elizabeth was in attendance, as were two of her brothers and her sister. Mr. Greenwood covered all the expenses. Following the funeral, pressure mounted on the police to solve this most brutal and seemingly unprovoked attack. Sarah Jane's sister told the officer that she had received a letter in which Sarah Jane had informed her that two gentlemen had made her a proposal of marriage, one who was earning £3 a week, but Sarah Jane had decided that she would not meet either of them again. It was suggested that the young housekeeper may have had a male companion who for some unknown reason had wanted to rid himself of her. However, the autopsy had shown that Sarah Jane had never been intimate with anyone. This theory was also dismissed by Mr. and Mrs. Greenwood and by Sarah Jane's previous employers, a respectable couple named Mr. and Mrs. Williams. Mr. Williams told the officers that neither himself or his wife had ever known her to have a sweetheart. In fact, her demeanour was always very modest, and she usually gave the impression that she did not want young gentlemen trying to make her acquaintance. Sarah Jane often received letters, and it was known that some of these were from potential suitors. However, when the police searched her room for these letters, they were nowhere to be found. The police concluded that for some reason she had destroyed them. Most people believed that the young housemaid must have known her killer, as she had let the person or persons into the house. There were those who also speculated that perhaps it was a burglary that had gone horribly wrong, although there had been nothing actually taken from the property. The police had very little to go on. There were no eyewitnesses, no murder weapon, and no obvious motive or suspect. All they had was a letter from the mysterious Mr. W. Wilson. Going over all of the events of the day, the police recounted that Mrs. Greenwood had been in her room, and shortly after Mr. Greenwood had gone out, Sarah Jane went to the room to help Mrs. Greenwood dress. However, she did not help her down the stairs. Instead, she told Mrs. Greenwood that she had things to attend to in the kitchen. Was she expecting a visitor, so made an excuse to return to the kitchen? Or did she feel that she should tidy up before Mr. Greenwood returned, and had no idea that anyone would be calling? Sarah Jane had been downstairs for 10 minutes, prior to Mrs. Greenwood hearing the door open. It was then silent for a short time, until Mrs. Greenwood heard the kitchen door close, followed by the screams. The only caller that they knew had come by was the milkman James Parlington, but he had been seen by several witnesses continuing with his rounds, so even though he confessed to being a great admirer of Sarah Jane, he was dismissed as a potential suspect. The inquest had returned a verdict of willful murder by a person or persons unknown. With no leads and no motive, rumours about who may have committed the crime spread throughout the city, and it seemed that no one was above suspicion. The letter, written by the unknown Mr. W. Wilson, was copied and circulated throughout the area in the hope that someone would be able to recognise the handwriting. Unfortunately, no one could. A reward was also offered for information that could lead to an arrest and a conviction. On Monday, the 26th of January 1880, The newspaper, the Leeds Mercury, reported a breakthrough in the case. 2 men had been arrested 280 miles away in the coastal town of Plymouth. Their names were Robert Heald and Thomas Laylock, although it was later determined that Robert Heald's real name was Thomas Waite. The men had been staying in a lodging house in Plymouth, and the landlady had told the local police that she had read about the crime in the newspapers, and knowing that the men had come from Manchester, wondered if they were the men responsible for the brutal murder of Miss Sarah Jane Roberts. Mr. Heald, or Thomas Waite, had asked her if she would wash a pair of trousers and a shirt for him. She said that they were both stained, but she could not be certain if the stains were blood. This gentleman had worked in Manchester as a coal dealer and had travelled to Plymouth as he planned to emigrate to Australia. He had also been wanted in Manchester on charges of perjury. 2 policemen arrived in Plymouth from Harperhay and arrested the 2 men. Witnesses then confirmed that they had seen them both in the neighbourhood where the murder of Miss Sarah Jane Roberts was committed. The police found that the handwriting on the letters that Thomas Waite had on his person were very similar to the handwriting on the letter that Mr. Greenwood had received from the mysterious Mr. W. Wilson. Mr. Waite was also known to Mr. Greenwood's business partner, Mr. Cooper. Both Mr. Waite and Mr. Laylock had strangely left Manchester shortly after the murder. Mr. Waite had lived for some time in Harperhay, but strangely under the name of Thomas Hales. He was married with a child and seemed to be planning to abandon the pair in order to travel to Australia. Despite the best efforts of the police, they were unable to produce enough evidence on either man to be able to charge them with murder. Mrs. Mary Ann Greenwood never recovered from the events that took place in her house on the 7th of January 1880 and died shortly afterwards. Her husband, Mr. Richard Greenwood, left Harperhay and went to live with friends. A public collection raised more than £50, which enabled a red marble headstone to be placed beside Sarah Jane's grave. It reads, "In memory of Sarah Jane Roberts, daughter of Hugh and Elizabeth Roberts of Merlin's Cross in the parish of St Michael's, Pembroke. Born March the 1st, 1862. Met her death by an unknown hand, January the 7th, 1880. To this day, the case remains unsolved, and the writer of the mysterious letter unknown."
The last case is from early 20th century USA. Eleanor Maud Parline, better known as Nora, was born in 1886 in China. She was the daughter of English parents who lived in East Asia as Nora's father worked as an engineer on a steamship. One evening in 1890, while the ship was at sea, he disappeared, and despite the crew searching both on board and in the ocean, they failed to find him. He was never seen or heard from again. Nora's mother, named Alice, then decided to leave China and went to live in San Francisco, where in 1891 she met and married a gentleman named Wilfred W. Fuller. At first the marriage was good, and Wilfred provided for Alice's 2 children, Louis and Nora. They also had 2 children of their own, a girl named Sybil and a boy named Wilfred, after his father. The couple did their best to bring up the 4 children, but they started to experience financial hardship, and in 1898 they divorced. Alice and her children went to live at 1747 Fulton Street, but her financial situation didn't improve. Nora was a sensible and sensitive girl, and in 1902, when she was 15 years old, she asked her mother if she could leave school and find employment. She thought that this would help to ease the family's financial worries. Alice was a bit concerned about this proposition, but she could see that Nora wanted to help and seemed determined to find employment, so she agreed. Nora eagerly searched the situation's vacant pages of the local newspapers, and on January the 8th, an advertisement appeared in the newspaper The Chronicle. It read, "Wanted, young girl to take care of a baby, good home and good wages. Anyone interested in the position should apply, care of The Chronicle." Nora was excited by this. She was good with children, as she often took care of her younger siblings. She asked her mother if she could apply. Her mother was slightly hesitant, but seeing how excited her daughter was about the opportunity, she agreed, and together they wrote a response to the advertisements. 3 days later, on Saturday the 11th of January, Nora received a response from a man named John Bennett. The response read, "Miss Fuller, in answer to your response to my advertisement, kindly call at the popular restaurant, 55 Geary Street, and inquire for Mr. John Bennett. Please come at 1 o'clock. If you can't come at 1, come at 6. Saturday came, and shortly after 5 p.m, Nora said goodbye to her mother, brothers and sister, and clutching Mr. Bennett's message, nervously made her way to the restaurant at 55 Geary Street. Nora's mother stayed at home with her other 3 children. About an hour later, she heard the telephone ring, but before she could get to it, it had been answered by her eldest son. The voice at the other end of the telephone, that sounded a bit like Nora, told him that she was at 1500 Geary Street, the home of Mr. Bennett. She said that she had been offered the position, and he wanted her to start straight away. Louis relayed this to his mother, who told him to tell Nora to come home and start work on Monday the 13th of January. Louis repeated the message, and the voice at the other end of the line said all right and hung up, but Nora did not come home. After he received the telephone call from Nora, or someone who sounded like Nora, Louis went out and came back at around 11 p.m. As he entered the house, his mother greeted him. She was crying and frantic with worry, as Nora had not returned. Louis told his mother not to worry and went to the popular restaurant to see if anyone was still there. But it was so late the restaurant was already closed. He then went to 1500 Geary Street, which was the address he had been given as to where his sister was going to work. But when he arrived, there was no house. The address was just a vacant lot. He returned and told his mother, who was beside herself with worry. The following day, Nora's mother, Alice Fuller, contacted the police. Detective Coleman was assigned to the case, and after interviewing Alice and her children, he went to the restaurant. He spoke to the owner, a well-known gentleman named Mr. F.W. Crone. He told the detective that on the 11th of January, at about 5:30 in the evening, a man who over the years had visited the restaurant on a number of occasions came to the counter and stated that he was expecting a girl to meet him there. So if anyone asked for Mr. John Bennett, they should be directed to the table where he was seated. No such girl, however, ever arrived, and the man left. Mr. Crone added that he saw this man walking up and down the street for a while afterwards, but a few minutes later, he had disappeared. The detective asked him to describe the man, who called himself John Bennett, and Mr. Crone said that he looked about 40 years old, 5 feet 9 inches tall, and probably weighed about 170 pounds. He had a brown moustache and was very well dressed. Interestingly, he added that whenever the man had previously visited the restaurant, he would always order porterhouse steaks, but would only ever eat the tenderloin part. The staff found this a little odd, and between themselves would always refer to him as Tenderloin. 3 days later, with only the lead from the restaurant, the police briefed local journalists on the disappearance. Detective Coleman interviewed 17-year-old Madge Graham, who had been a good friend of Nora's since June 1901, when she had boarded in the Fuller's house for a short time. She told the detective that Nora often spoke to her about a friend she had, whose name was Bennett. She said Nora regularly telephoned him and once told her mother that she and Madge were going to the theatre, when in fact, Nora was meeting Mr. Bennett. Madge suggested that the advertisement may have been some sort of trick conceived by Mr. Bennett and Nora so they could run away together. Another gentleman named Mr. Mink, who ran a local grocery store, told the detective that Nora would regularly make telephone calls from his phone to someone in a hotel. He found this strange, as he knew that she had a telephone in her house, but despite the additional information and the interest from the press, the police were no nearer to finding Nora Fuller. On February the 8th, a rent collector named Fred Crawford, who worked for the property agency, named Umson & Co. reported that a recently rented property at 2211 Sutter Street had still not been occupied. He considered this unusual as he knew that a tenant had taken on the lease a month earlier, and when he called to collect the rent, it looked like it was empty. The manager asked Fred Crawford and another employee named Mr. Dean to return to the property to see why the tenant had not moved in. He gave them a spare key and told them that if the property looked empty, they must use a key to enter it and see what was going on. The two men arrived at 2211 Sutter Street. They knocked, but there was no answer. They noticed there was no furniture on the ground floor, and after a brief discussion, decided to enter the property. They looked around, and it looked like no one had been there for a while. There was no cooker, no plates, and no food. The property was damp, and there was a strange, rather unpleasant smell. They made their way upstairs, where they saw that there was a couple of items of furniture, but no evidence that the property was occupied. When they went to a back room, they saw that the door was closed. It seemed very strange, as all the other doors had been left open. Fred slowly opened it and peered inside. The room was dark, the curtains were closed, but he could see some bright-coloured objects on the floor. Fred and Mr. Dean felt there was something not quite right about the whole setup, so hurried out of the building. But their experience and intuition made them think that they needed to see what was inside the back room. They sat down and considered what to do, when at the corner of the street they saw a policeman named Officer Gill. They rushed over and asked him to accompany them back to the house. He agreed, and the three men entered the property. Led by the officer, they made their way upstairs and entered the back room. Officer Gill walked to the window to open the curtain, and as the light shone in, his attention turned to the bed, where laying, covered in pristine white sheets, was the body of a young girl. Officer Gill immediately realised that the deceased could be the missing girl, Nora Fuller, so sealed the property and reported back to the station. Detectives soon arrived and conducted a thorough search of 2211 Sutter Street. There was not much there, only a folded blanket, a quilt on the bed, and a chair in the corner of the room. In the lounge they found a discarded cigar and an almost empty bottle of whiskey. Many letters are also found, addressed to Mr. C.B. Hawkins, many of which were from furniture stores. One thing that particularly interested the police was a letter addressed to Mr. Hawkins and bearing a postmark of the 21st of January, which was 10 days after Nora Fuller had last been seen. The letter had been opened and carefully placed in the deceased girl's jacket. There was, however, no trace of the postcard Nora had received from John Bennett. Mrs. Alice Fuller identified the clothing as belonging to her daughter, and when she had the traumatic task of identifying the body, she confirmed that it was Nora. A post-mortem was ordered, and it was concluded that the cause of death was strangulation. A toxologist examined the deceased's stomach and found no evidence of drugs or poisons. The papers had been reporting about the missing girl since the 16th of January, and it had become a topic of conversation in San Francisco. Now, however, it was considered a high-profile case, and a leading detective named John Seymour took control of the investigation. The police had found Nora's purse, which contained a business card from a gentleman named Mr. M. Severbrinick. He was traced, but quickly eliminated from their inquiries, as he had sailed to China 3 hours before Nora left home on January the 11th. Detective Seymour turned his attention to John Bennett and C.B. Hawkins. But who were these two elusive characters? He spoke to the staff at Umson & Co.'s real estate office, who were the agency responsible for finding a tenant for the property where Nora was found. Their record showed that on the 8th of January, a man named Mr. C.B. Hawkins visited their office and inquired about the possibility of renting the property at 2211 Sutter Street. The staff remembered him as a very well-dressed gentleman, and he agreed to take the house, but said he was unable to provide references as he was new to San Francisco. He did, however, pay 1 month's rent in advance, so the contract was drawn up and the gentleman signed it in the name of C.B. Hawkins. The staff recalled that during their conversations with him, he had told them that he was currently staying with his wife at the Golden West Hotel. The description that the staff gave of this gentleman was almost identical to the description of Mr. John Bennett given by the owner and staff of the popular restaurant. When the police checked the Golden West Hotel, the clerk named Edward Petrie found no record of a guest by the name of C.B. Hawkins, but he confirmed that a man of that name had mail sent there. The detective then started to trace the furniture in the house. There were only a few items, but the real estate agent had confirmed that the house was empty when the tenant took possession of it. They visited the J.C. Kavanagh furniture store at 848 Mission Street, where they discovered that on the 9th of January, a well-dressed gentleman, fitting the description of the man known as Hawkins, or Bennett, entered the store and said that he temporarily wished to furnish a room. He purchased 2 second-hand pillows, a pair of blankets, and some sheets. The man told the assistant that the items must only be delivered at night. He gave the address of 2211 Sutter Street. He was remembered by the store staff as he had a very elegant silk hat. The delivery boy told Detective Seymour that when he took the items to the address, the man who was still wearing the hat answered the door and instructed him just to leave the items in the hallway, which he did and left. The bed and the chair were traced to the Standard Furniture Company at 745 Mission Street. The staff confirmed that the gentleman who had purchased the items on the 10th of January and the description they gave of him matched that of Hawkins or Bennett. They remembered that he was worried that the mattress would be substituted for a different one of less quality, so the salesman told the man to write his initials on it. The man then took a heavy pencil and in large letters wrote CBH on the mattress. When the items were delivered by the delivery men, the man asked them to take the bed and the chair upstairs and place them in the back room. The towel and pillowcases were traced to Mrs. Mahoney's dry goods store, which was just around the corner from the Standard Furniture Company. As these were easy to carry, the elegantly dressed gentleman took them away with him. A handwriting expert examined the original slips filled out by Bennett for his advertisement in the newspaper and compared them to the signature of C.B. Hawkins on the contract for the rented property at 2211 Sutter Street. He concluded that both were written by the same hand. The police were now convinced that Mr. Bennett and Mr. Hawkins were indeed the same person. A reward was offered to anyone who had information that led to the discovery and apprehension of the person responsible for the crime. The police thought it possible that the murderer had changed address, so may have sent a written notification to the postal authorities. Handwriting experts examined 32,000 address change notifications, and one proved to be very interesting, which was that of a man named Captain Seymour, who now lived in Kansas City. 2 officers were sent to interview him, but they soon realised that he was not the person they were looking for. The police also wondered if it was just coincidence that Nora's friend Madge Graham, who once boarded in her house, now lived at 2088 Sutter Street, only 150 yards from the house where Nora died. The case was now being reported in all the San Francisco papers. The photo of the mattress was published, which bore the initials CBH, and was seen by a lady named Miss Blazier, whose boyfriend had disappeared on January the 16th, 5 days after Nora went missing. She had reported his disappearance to the police, but they had failed to locate him. They thought that he may have left the state, as after he disappeared, his employer discovered that money had been taken from their accounts. Her boyfriend's name was Charles B. Hadley, and she showed the police a photo of him on which he had written his initials, CBH. The resemblance to the writing on the mattress was striking. She also said that when the papers reported the disappearance of the young girl, he became agitated and thoroughly read all the articles about it. He phoned her that evening to say that he would not be home that night, and she had not seen him since. Miss Blazier also said that he had left some blood-stained clothes in the laundry. and as he had not returned or contacted her, she burned them. Interestingly, she was also able to confirm that he very much liked porterhouse steaks, but only ever ate the tenderloin part. Handwriting samples from C.B. Hadley were sought from his employer and compared to the signature of C.B. Hawkins on the contract with Umson & Co. and the CBH on the mattress. Experts concluded that all three men were indeed the same person. C.B. Hadley, however, did not have a moustache and was always clean-shaven, but Miss Blazier said that he often wore a false brown moustache, which he had purchased from a store on Larking Street. The police started to investigate C.B. Hadley. They discovered that his name was actually Charles Starts, and it was believed that he was from Chicago, as that was where his mother lived. He was wanted for embezzlement, committed in Minneapolis in 1889. They also found out that in 1900 he had tried to seduce a girl of a similar age to Nora. The story of the death of Nora Fuller and the hunt for the man known as Hawkins, Bennett, Hadley or Start had now reached the attention of newspapers across the country, and the police were confident that with all the coverage, they would soon be able to locate and arrest the suspect. Unfortunately, their confidence was short-lived, as there were no reported sightings of him. As time passed, the newspapers moved on to other stories, and the police committed fewer officers to Nora's case, as they were needed on other investigations. The case of Nora Fuller remains unsolved, and what became of the man who went by the name of Hawkins, Bennett, Hadley or Start still remains a mystery. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next Brief Case